Awesome. Okay, so if you did the React tutorial this weekend, some of this is going to be a little bit of a review, but I'm going to give the intro to React, and then the rest of the day, Davey will be coding along, and we'll be building a React application from scratch. So a little bit about React. Who wants to read what's on the screen? Harrison.
What is React? A declarative, efficient, and flexible JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It encourages the creation of reusable UI components that present data that changes over time.
Thank you. So declarative, efficient, flexible, reusable UI components. These are some of the things that we'll be talking about today. Last week we were manipulating the DOM itself. This week we'll be using React to do that, to change the user interfaces. So first of all, what's declarative and imperative? What are those things? In programming languages, in programming we talk about languages in these ways. Are they declarative? Are they imperative? So what do those two words mean? So when we talk about imperative, we're talking about how to do something. So the programmer has to specify the exact operations that they want to happen. When we're talking about declarative, we're talking about just making a declaration and saying what you want to happen. So for example, when you're arriving at a restaurant, let's say Davey and I are going out to lunch, and I approach the host stand and I say, hello, good morning. Can you please take out 2 menus, some silverware, walk Davey and me over to the table, set the silverware down, set the menus down, maybe open them for us, tell us to have a seat, welcome us to the restaurant, tell us who our server is going to be, and then tell us to have a nice lunch and walk away.
Don't forget the napkins, I'm real sloppy.
Right. So if I say that to the host or hostess, what is that? Imperative or declarative? Imperative, because I'm telling her exactly what I want done, how to do it, each step of the way. But if I just approach the host and say, table for 2, please, what is that? Declarative. I'm just making a declaration. I want a table for 2. Another way of thinking about it is driving a car. So who knows the difference between manual and automatic? Manual car, you get in, you press the clutch and the brake, put it in first gear, slowly take your foot off the clutch, put some on the gas, then you got to shift to second, shift to third. That's imperative. You're telling it how to do something each step along the way. Declarative is a manual car. You just put it in drive, I want to drive, and you go. So when you think about writing code and making a website or a web app, I think it'd be easier to make it declarative, right? And that's what React does. React is a declarative language. So you don't have to tell it exactly how to do something each step along the way. So let's look at an example. So here's some code. So as the programmer, I say, okay, create a function, call it multiply by 3. Then create a variable, name it multiplied array, give it the value of an empty array. Then create a new variable I, start it at 0. Then as long as I is less than the length of the original array, keep doing this next line of code. And then each time increase I by 1. Then create another variable called multiplied number. What do you think this is? Imperative or declarative? Imperative. Telling it every little thing to do. This is declarative. So much shorter, so much more efficient. Just map over the original array, multiply each number by 3. So when we say it's declarative, that's what we mean. And you'll hear that a lot in programming when you're talking about different languages. And people are like, oh, that's a really declarative language. Okay, now I know what that means. So what else is it? It's efficient. So before we were using the actual DOM, right? When we were writing our code, React uses something called the virtual DOM. So what it does is it takes a snapshot of the DOM. It creates its own virtual DOM. And then as data changes, it updates only that part of the DOM where the data has changed. So it compares the original DOM to this virtual DOM, and it doesn't redraw the entire page. It just redraws that small little portion or different sections of the code that has changed. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a little bit. And then it also has reusable components. So instead of having to write, let's say, you have a header on every page of an application, let's say. Instead of having to write that code for every single different page, you just write it once, and then you just inject that component into your code. So you don't have to keep rewriting that code. That's just one example of a reusable component. So a React app, every React app, needs just 4 things. So it needs an HTML page with at least one empty element. Most often, it's an empty div. It needs a React library, of course, and you just import that, and we'll show you how to do that. It needs 1 or more React components. And then it needs 1 JavaScript call that attaches that React component to the empty HTML element from that step 1. And we'll show you how that happens too. So those are the 4 building blocks of a React application. So I've been saying component a lot. What does that mean? So we've seen this before. This is just some like typical HTML. Again, it's like that header that I talked about. There's an H1, an H2, there's an unordered list. Looks like some nav links. That's just typical HTML. We've seen this. We've been writing it the last week. But wouldn't it be awesome if we could just put something short like that, a one-liner, our own customized tag? So that's what a React component looks like. So take a look at the screen. So here is a React component. Typically, you put components in their own files. That's what you will see most commonly. So this will be one file, let's say. And it doesn't have to be, but oftentimes the component is a class. And then we just name this component app header. And then that extends from something called React component, which is just a part of that React library. And then every class has a render function or method on it. And then that render method just returns what looks like maybe HTML, but it's actually called JSX. So JSX stands for JavaScript XML. And so there's a couple different things in this, different from an HTML, your regular HTML. So can anyone see there's 2 specific things that are different about just the chunk between the header tags that makes this JSX and not just regular HTML? Yes. Yes, that's good. So it says class name instead of class. Do you remember the class attribute that we've been applying to different tags? This says class name. And the reason for that is because class is a reserved word. See how we use it on the first line? So we need to change that to class name in every instance that we want to apply a class to something in JSX. So there's one more thing. Yep. In between those curly braces, there's a JavaScript expression, this.props.name. So we'll get a little bit more into props, but basically JSX allows you to inject JavaScript in your markup. So that might seem a little counterintuitive because last week we were like, okay, put your JavaScript file over here, put your HTML file over here, keep them separate. But what JSX is it allows you to combine that logic, combine your markup with your JavaScript. So again, it might look like HTML, but it's actually just JavaScript. So under the hood, that H1 line actually becomes react.createElement, and then those 3 parameters. And that's what JSX is doing under the hood. But we don't want to have to write that, because if we wanted this code, it would have to look like that. And then there's a lot more lines in there. That's just the first couple lines of this. So that's just for your knowledge. I mean, just so you know what's happening under the hood. But you're just going to be writing what looks like HTML. It's just called JSX, and you can inject JavaScript within it. So what are props? Props is short for properties, but it's just common to call them props. So if you think of a React component as just a JavaScript function, the props are the arguments to those functions. So props can be just like functions. You could pass in anything like strings or numbers, even functions themselves, objects. So for example, there's a function alert me, just has an alert. In the middle is your React component. The component's name is my component. It has a render method. It returns some JSX. But if you look at the button, it has an onClick function where it says, okay, here there's an anonymous function and this .props.alert me. So what's props? What's this .props? Well, when we call the component or when we use the component, we pass in 3 props. The first prop is alert me. This is what we call the prop. This is something, the name that we assign it. It's alert me. And the value of that is the alert me function. Then we pass in a second prop that we call my fave. And we just pass it the value of a Boolean, in this case, true. And then another prop, the third prop, that we just call name. And we pass it the string Emilio. So when we have our component and we tell it to render this JSX, we say, when we click that button, this .props.alert me, pass in this prop. So that function will run, that alert me function. On the second line, we say, my name is this.props.name. So we access this third prop, name. And so when we render it, it'll say, my name is Emilio. Same thing on the next line. My favorite Boolean is this.props.myfave. This is what we called it, my fave. The value will be true. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? The way we access our props is calling this.props. And then whatever name we gave it. So even though this function name is alert me, we could call it whatever we want. We don't have to call it alert me. It makes sense to, but these are just the names we're giving it. And then we're assigning it those values. And like I said, they could be strings, they could be Booleans, functions, objects, whatever you might want. So something important to note about props is that they're what's called immutable. You can't change them. So they're just a piece of data that gets sent to the component and they're unchangeable. So if I wanted to change Emilio, I couldn't pass it in as a prop. I'd have to do it another way. So how would I do that? Something called state. So if you want to modify the data that gets passed through a component, it has to be within the state of the application. So it's initialized in what's called the component's constructor, which we've done constructors before just last week. And then you modify it using what's called the setState method. So here's an example. We have our component at the top. We've named it clicky counter. It extends from React component. That's just React from the React library. Then we have a constructor. And in that constructor, we have something called this.state. And we assign the value of count, or the value of 0 to count in the state. So right now, clicky counter knows that there's a variable called count in our state, and it's 0. Well, if I wanted to update that, I'd have to create a new method that actually sets a new state. So here we've created a method called updateCount. We've called this.setState. And we've assigned count the new value of this.state.count, which is 0, plus 1. And then every time we run that method, it just adds 1 to it. So this .state.count, putting this .state in front of it is how you reference it. And you could have multiple properties on this .count or this .state. So you could have count and you could have other properties too. So then within the render function, you return that JSX. And then on the click of the button, you would run that method update count. And then the paragraph tag button has been clicked, this .state.count times just references whatever that number is. Questions? So the fourth part of the 4 parts of the React application is just attaching it to the DOM. And again, this is just kind of for your knowledge, because if you run it, if you do a create React app through the command line, which is what we're going to do for our project, it already does this for you. But just so you know, you have to attach you have to make a JavaScript call that attaches your component app to the DOM. So, okay, at the very top, we have our HTML, our actual HTML, like that index.html file, where we have an empty div with the ID of root. And we need that there for a React application. So you're always going to have one empty element. Typically, it's a div. Typically, it has an ID of root. You have your app component. And then you have this JavaScript call. And this is just saying, hey, React DOM, render this root component app. Where do I render it? You have to get that element by the ID of root up in the HTML doc. Render it there. Attach it to that empty div. And that's it. That's all you got to do. Again, when you run create React app, which is a command line, which is a command that you run in your terminal, it'll do this for you. But if you're ever building it from scratch, or if you're practicing a new application or anything like that, it's good to know. You have to have this to attach that. And then the app application, or the app component, is basically that root component, and all other components will stem from there. And that's it. Pretty simple. It could get more complicated. But just remember those 4 things. An HTML page, just index.html. You need to import the React library, which we'll do. Have 1 or more React components. And then that last JavaScript call. Any questions on that? I feel like I went maybe a little fast.
You said that usually there's the ID of root for the React element. HTML element that you're connecting with React.
Yep.
And so is there usually only one of those per page then?
There's one. There's one for the whole application.
So all your React has to be in one.
Yeah, everything is going to go in that one tag. Yes.
So you said we need an HTML page, but for this tutorial, we just used the JavaScript file.
They probably already gave you the
Yeah.
and you just never had to look at it. Did you do it on your own computer or in the browser?
On the computer?
So you use create React app.
Yeah.
That puts the HTML page in a public folder.
Oh, but not
So
in
you
the
never have
source.
to touch
It's
it.
not in the source.
It's not in the source.
Right. Questions? Any more questions?
Will this be available?
Yeah, it'll be on the website. Alrighty.